Hi everyone, welcome to session 4. I can't believe it's session 4 already of Most, and this time we're looking at getting the most out of fellowship. I don't know what comes to your mind when you think of fellowship. Sometimes it's just seen as a kind of the social thing that we do after a service or before a service, or when we catch up with each other. It's kind of that time where we have a cup of tea and a few biscuits or something like that. But fellowship in the New Testament is much, much more. In fact, the word itself has something of the flavor of being in partnership with each other. So it's an important word, it's an important concept, it's a very strong concept. And it's very important for us because when Jesus talked about the church, he talked about the church in terms of people being in relationship with each other. So when he talks in that way, he's talking about something that's much more than just an organization or a bunch of people getting together and doing their religious thing and then having a cup of tea. No, he's talking about us being joined together in love. And for that reason, the first thing I would say about getting the most out of fellowship is to recognize that Christ, both in terms of what he taught and in terms of his work of dying and rising again for us, Christ is at the very center of fellowship. His love for us and the love that he expects us to show for one another is at the very heart of fellowship. When Jesus was on this earth, he said that we were to love our enemies. He said that we were to love our neighbors. He said that we were to love one another. When you look at all of those statements and you add them up, effectively, we're supposed to love everyone. You know, if you've got to love your enemies, if you've got to love your neighbors, presumably you love your friends, and if we've got to love one another, well, then that kind of takes in the whole world. Interesting, though, to note that he doesn't say that we should love all of these different people in the same way. He talks about loving our neighbors as ourselves, but he talks about us loving one another as he has loved us, and that's taking love to a higher level. So love, or fellowship, is all about this expression of love, of loving one another, of loving our neighbors, but particularly when we're looking at it within the context of the church, fellowship is something it's about church, it's about us loving one another. Now, some people, when they hear that term, love one another, some people will interpret that in one way and some in another way. Some people will say, well, if we're supposed to love one another, everybody should love me. Other people will say, well, if we're supposed to love one another, I've just got to love everybody, whatever. Now, it is important that we love others without expecting to receive anything in return. But for fellowship to work, it's got to be a two-way thing. It's not just enough to say, well, because Jesus said love one another, everyone should love me. And at the same time, there's something wrong if we just think that we've got to love others without ever receiving love from them. So the ideal situation, the ideal scenario is that we give and receive love, whether that's in a small group or in a larger group. Though the larger the group gets, the harder it is to give and receive love to and from one another. But it's very important to take Jesus' words and apply them right at the outset, that we're to love one another, and that is a two-way thing. We should be able to put ourselves into context where we're able to give and receive love. Second thing about getting the most out of fellowship is this: if we want to get the most out of fellowship, recognize that the church is a community. The word that's used for church in the New Testament is the word ecclesia, and it's a gathering together of people. Peter talks in 1 Peter 2, he talks about we're a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation belonging to God. We have been gathered together. We have been made a people. Paul says those of us who weren't a people have been made a people. When God saved you, he didn't just save you as an individual so that you would go through life and eventually get to heaven one day, though that is true. He loves you as an individual, and he will welcome you into heaven one day as an individual. But he wants you to be part of a loving community called the church. And that's why love's so important, because as a community, love is the glue that holds us together. Another aspect of this community, and one of the ways that community was worked out in the New Testament, was in what we know as communion, or the breaking of bread. That's why it was so central to the life of the early church. The people broke bread together. In the ancient world, to be invited to someone's table to share a meal with them was a big honor indeed. You didn't just invite everyone to come to your table. And so we have the table of the Lord. We're invited to come and share with each other and share with him. And the early church recognized this, and they made it one of their priorities. Acts 2:42, one of the things that they committed themselves to, along with the apostles' teaching, and along with fellowship and prayer, was communion. So there you have it, Acts 2:42. They committed themselves to fellowship, and they committed themselves to that expression of fellowship, which is communion. So clearly this was something that was very important to Jesus, to the disciples, and to the church in the book of Acts. What happens, however, when fellowship crashes, or when communion crashes, when our relationships get to a place where something comes in and there's some sort of dispute or disagreement, and we find ourselves in conflict with one another? Well, Jesus says in Matthew 18, and he makes it very clear, he says, if you have a problem with someone, go and talk to them and try and sort it out between you. Don't go and tell your friend. Don't go and tell the people around you to try and get them on your side. Go and talk to the person, speak to them, talk it through with them. And if you can't get things resolved in that way, well then take someone else along that can be like a kind of a middle person who can mediate between the two of you. And hopefully the three of you together will be able to resolve the conflict. And then Jesus says, if that still doesn't work, well then take it to the church. And I think in our context that would mean we'll get some of the church leaders, or some of a wider body of people involved in trying to resolve the conflict. Because the reality is that no matter how good a church is, no matter how good things are, and no matter how loving people are, sometimes there are conflicts, sometimes there are disagreements. Jesus never said there would be no disagreements. He said there would be disagreements, but he gave us a way to work out those disagreements, to work out those conflicts together. So we've got this picture of fellowship as being something that's Christ-centered. We've got this picture of the church as a community, and we have this whole thing about communion and how our sense of community and togetherness is expressed that way. And then we have Jesus teaching us how to resolve conflict. A final thing I think should be said about getting the most from fellowship is, if you're going to get the most from fellowship, you've got to be committed to it. You can't just be casual about it, just sort of drift into the group or drift into the church and drift out and then complain because no one loves you. The reason that you're not feeling the love is that you're not getting close enough and you're not around long enough to feel any of the love. Well, perhaps. But if we're going to get the most from fellowship, we need to be committed to fellowship. Acts 2:42 again. They devoted themselves to fellowship. They devoted themselves to the breaking of bread. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 14:26, he says, when you come together as the church, everybody, this is my paraphrase, my translation, Everybody should have something to share. Some of you will have a hymn or a psalm or a tongue or an interpretation, and then he goes on. People will have prophetic words. So what Paul's saying is, he says, when we get together as a connect group or in some other sort of group, we should come prepared to share something. Probably the best way to do that is to pray beforehand. To say, God, I'm going to my connect group. Is there anything that you would like to say? Is there something that you would like me to share to encourage the people that are present? The same goes for Sundays. Why don't you pray before you come to Sunday service? God, if there's something that you want me to share with someone, would you help me to do that? Would you give me something? Even ask God the people that you should go and talk to. Ask God for significant conversations so that you will be able to contribute to the fellowship of the church, contribute to the fellowship of either the meeting of the church when it meets in a larger group on Sundays, or when the church meets in those smaller connect groups midweek. You can prepare your heart and commit yourself to come along with something to share so that the church is built up, so that people are built up, so that people are encouraged, and so that fellowship is strengthened.